So we've been in this series called Holy Shift. This is week 2, and we look around at our world today, and there's a lot of chaos and a lot of disorder, and I think a lot of us are just here trying to make sense of what we're experiencing in our lives, what we're experiencing in the world. And a lot of this involves some major shifts and some major changes. And what I think my hope is for this series is to realize, like, these changes, these shifts are not just things that we might experience or can experience, but in many ways they are guaranteed, right? And so how do we flow with life amidst these changes that ultimately expand us and have opportunity for growth and renewal and healing? And so last week we talked about the stages of faith that we go through as human beings, and that along each of these stages we have these opportunities to expand and grow. But something that you might have noticed, and you did not need to be here last week to have ever reflected upon this, but you might notice that we have these moments in our lives where things fall apart, right? Things break down, things stop working, beliefs change. And perhaps these are all part of a larger transition and evolution that we experience in our lives, that there are things that give way to something new and something different. And so last week we talked about this in terms of our internal journeys, and this week I want to zoom out and really look at this from the level of society and institutions. And really we're going to look at how this has occurred when it comes to religion, but in many ways we can apply it to all kinds of things. We can apply these changes, these shifts, to all these different things we're seeing in our world today. And certainly we can apply this to ourselves, because anything we see out there, anything that we want to judge or criticize out there, we can also find it in here, right? And so really we're going to go on this journey of asking what might be falling apart, right? What might feel like it's dying, and yet at the same time, what is being born in our world? And so sure, we're going to talk about religion, and that for many of us is a bad word, right? It's a negative word. It holds a lot of baggage. Words and concepts around religion for so much of us, it holds some kind of baggage. Pretty recently, I was talking to someone, and I met them for the first time, and I told them I was a pastor. And they said, can you get married? And I was like, oh man, religion, all this baggage with religion, it's so complicated. People have so many interesting ideas, and they assume so many things. And so with religion today, I really wanted this to just be a word that we're using to talk about spirituality in community and the practices that we engage in together as a group, right? But in general, when we think about religion, we think about the world religions, right? We think about these big structures and these big institutions. And when it comes to those things, there is certainly a lot that's worth giving up on, right? That there are things that have failed us, that there are things that aren't working. And yet my encouragement for us today is that we don't give up on the idea of gathering and having a sense of spiritual community, and we find what's worth holding on to. That in many ways, we have used this metaphor before, that in many ways we try to rescue the baby from the bathwater, right? That we've heard this phrase, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And in many ways, we need to go on a search to find those things worth rescuing, right? To find those things worth holding on to. Because when it comes to religion, in many ways, we are all swimming in what feels like some very dirty bathwater sometimes. And we look at our world today, and it feels in some ways like the drain plug has been pulled. And we're honestly trying to figure out what is worth saving, what is worth rescuing. This is an image that you probably didn't expect to be told, go into your head this morning. And so there's more to come, don't worry. Friends, it's no secret that when it comes to the institution of religion, we're in the midst of some kind of decline or some kind of chaos, that there is a big shift that's happening. And I believe that probably explains why many of us are here, is because the institution, right, organized religion didn't exactly work for us. And so you might have mixed feelings when you think about this idea that things are amidst this massive shift, right? You might feel glad on some level. You might think, well, no, we're about due for something like this. You might also feel a sense of heartbreak or a sense of bittersweetness, reflecting on the ways in which you did experience some beautiful things as part of a more traditional, organized religious structure. And so you might have some mixed feelings about all this, but one thing is certain, that we are in midst of some massive change, right? And so the question or the idea behind this holy shift that we're talking about today is to really ask, as things fall apart, right, is something else being reborn? And this might be really hard to see, right? When things feel overwhelming, when things feel chaotic, when we feel like we're surrounded by all this disorder, it takes a certain perspective, right? We need to develop on some level eyes to be able to see the hope amidst all that's going on. And so that's my intention for this series, to see what we're experiencing as part of a larger process. And so while last week that process was the stages of faith, this week what we're going to be talking about is the stages of religious renewal. Religious renewal. Is renewal possible when it comes to what we're experiencing in the world today, and particularly around religion? And so as we go through this process, right, some of it might feel a little bit like a downer because, things need to fall apart on some level. But I promise you there is a happy ending because it does end in renewal. It's kind of like that movie, It's a Wonderful Life. Like by the title, it sounds like it's a super happy movie, but so much of it is kind of depressing and bleak. And then you have a happy ending. I'm sorry if I spoiled it for any of you, but it's been out for, I think, 70 years. So I think, But see, you might be here today, and you might be looking around at what's going on in the world, and you might be thinking, I need to believe that there is some higher purpose, right? There is some kind of movement towards something good, that there is a movement towards renewal and rejuvenation. And why does it feel like things have to fall apart to get there? And I want to start with a quote that may seem like it's a little out of left field, but I think it totally relates. This is Picasso. Every act of creation is first an act of destruction. Sometimes this is how the universe works, right? How life works, how God works, that things at times need to break apart to give way to something more life-giving. And so today, as we talk through this idea of renewal and rejuvenation, I'm going to blend a couple different perspectives, and I'm going to draw from the ideas of a Canadian anthropologist named Anthony Wallace, who in the 50s and 60s wrote about something called revitalization movements. His work focused primarily on indigenous people and how within indigenous culture, there would be these movements that arose to address things that were missing and things that were broken, and ways of experiencing renewal and revitalization. And he expanded outside of indigenous culture and was able to really apply these concepts to religion. And I hope maybe for you today, you could even apply them beyond that. But I want to start today and really ask, how many of us grew up in a world, or at least the way we look back on it, the way we remember things, maybe it was in our childhood or in our upbringing, when it came to religion and religious institutions, things were pretty simple. Things felt fairly stable, fairly black and white, right? Maybe it worked for you, maybe it didn't. But I want to use Christianity almost as a case study today because it's something that, for us in the West, it's the water that we've swam in. It's something that most of us are familiar with or grew up with. This doesn't apply exclusively to Christianity, but I think it's a helpful lens for much of us. And so last week, we talked about these stages of faith, and we really talked about those moments when the religion or the faith that we grew up with, that we were handed, it stopped working for us. We began to ask questions of it, and we found that maybe there were some cracks in the foundation. And certainly, we experience this as individuals, right? Moments where things and beliefs began to be challenged. But then there's also this sense that perhaps these cracks, right, these questions actually apply on a broader scale, that there are some cracks in the foundation of the institutions themselves, right? That these institutions are going through major change, major upheaval. And so this kind of these stages that we're going to work through, they start by really analyzing what is going on, right? What is going on with religion and really making sense of what's going on with it today. And so like last week, because this is kind of a heavy and complex topic, I'm going to use emojis to kind of simplify things. And so I want to start with the first stage, loss of legitimacy. And it's that right? That feeling of something's amiss, right? Something's going on. You might have felt this, but something is up with organized religion. It's probably why a lot of you are here. And we look at religion and we go, in many expressions of religion, it feels that there is something out of touch with its own values, out of touch with the needs of its own people and the needs of others, right? And we even look at perhaps religion in this stage, and we recognize leaders that are corrupt, are hypocritical, are dogmatic. Now, like last week, I'm going to ask you to use your imagination, because this is totally nothing that any of us have ever experienced in our lives, right, or in our world. It's totally hard to imagine. But if you could just imagine this, no, I'm just kidding. We've all kind of experienced some version of this, right? We may have lived through this. We might feel like we're living in this world right now. And the reality is, friends, is that when you have something like these religious structures that are around for a long time, and they become so resistant to change, that in many ways, there's a loss of purpose, right? Like, what is the point? What are we even doing here? And when the purpose really is built around just holding on to what it used to be, it's almost like that TV show that should have ended at season 3, and then it goes to like season 10, and you're like, we all know what show that is for us, right? But there is this experience that we see in our world and in society when there is a resistance to something new and there's a resistance to change. And at the same time, we know this in ourselves. We know the moments in our own lives when we are resistant to change, when we are resistant to something new coming through. And so we focus on holding on to what was, and it starts to challenge the very core of who we are. We lose our purpose. We lose our connection to culture, right? And like these institutions, there's a loss of connection to culture, a loss of connection to people. And in many ways, there is a resorting to things like fear and a defensiveness and dogma. And though we've all experienced this, at the same time, it doesn't necessarily need to discount the good things that we've experienced in these environments. I was having a conversation with a friend this week, and he was telling me about a time in his life when he experienced some really much needed help and much needed support from a church that maybe he no longer resonates with, right? The doctrine or the dogma. But at the time, it provided this incredible resource for him. And I think it's permission, friends, for us not to look back at previous moments in our journey and just disregard everything that happened because we have changed and we've shifted and we've in some ways outgrown those beliefs and ideas. And that's my encouragement, that we can still hold on and we can still see the good. But we do outgrow certain beliefs and we do outgrow certain environments. And in many ways, this process is aided or even pushed along by these environments continuing to cascade downhill, because after this loss of legitimacy, what we experience are institutional failures, right? We see within organized religion all these scandals and all these different failures, both financial and moral failures. And really, it's no surprise, because when your center of gravity stops being love, but it's really about just holding up this structure, this thing, the way that it's supposed to be or the way it used to be, we can see why the environments become toxic. And yet we do this with ourselves, right? We lose our sense of purpose, and so it kind of just, things start to fall apart. And you might have noticed, right? Maybe you're not keeping up with what's going on with religion, but maybe you're just on streaming, and you might have noticed the slew of documentaries that have come out that involve some kind of failure of some church or the institution at large. Maybe if you're not a streamer, then, podcasts are your thing, you might have seen. Or maybe you're just a reader and you found the numerous books, right? But it's all over the place, right? The writing is on the wall. There is a website you can go to called The Roy's Report, which basically is a journalism site where they document any kind of scandal or any sort of corruption that's going on in the evangelical church, and they just document every single scenario and instance of it. And this is the site where they just have all the ongoing investigations. And it's just another example. There is a lot that is going on. And it's just really sad and really telling of this season of, kind of this era that we're in. If this wasn't enough to kind of prove this point, between the last 70 years, studies have been conducted to ask Americans, what is your faith in, or like what, level of trust do you have in organized religion? And it has dropped from 68 to 32% over the last 70 years. So it's dropped by more than half, right? And so it really begs the question, are all of these things, all these failures, all these instances of corruption or scandals, are they isolated incidents, or are they part of some kind of larger pattern? Because if so, it's simply too much to ignore. But friends, I do have hope, and I believe that there is hope that is a part of this conversation. Diana Butler Bass says this: the failure of religion is not the failure of faith. Instead, it is an invitation to a spiritual awakening. The end of conventional religion opens the path to a more vital faith. People are not leaving the church because they have lost faith. They are leaving the church to preserve their faith. Does this sound anything like your journey, right? Leaving something in order to find the core or to find the heart of it. I know that there are many people here in this space, and I would count myself among them, who are recovering from some wounds and some pain that's been experienced through organized religion or conventional religion, as Diana Butler Bass calls it. And I find that there is so much healing that is possible when we recognize that those painful moments, those difficult things that happened, were not simply these isolated incidents, but they are part of this larger trend and this larger shift. And these things were not your fault, right? You didn't fail your religion or your church. It failed you. And so when you walked away, when you left the church in order to preserve your faith, that was a courageous act. Because it was this beginning of a recognition that the whole thing is in need of renewal. The whole thing is in need of change. And so you had the courage to let it go, right? Because that's part of that process. And as you let it go into the next stage, crisis and disintegration. I was trying to find the right emoji. A little gross, though, so I thought I'd just stick with that one, There is this phase that institutions enter into at this point of deep fragmentation, right? Of this sense that it is kind of devouring itself from within, that there are competing factions even within the faith. There is anger and there is hatred even on itself. It's eating itself. And if this is an idea that seems kind of far-fetched to you, I want you to guess how many denominations of Christianity, just Christianity, do you think there are in the world? Any wild guesses? 300? We got 300? 1,000? 10,000. Okay. 45,000. Oh, you're saying you're your own denomination? 45,000. 45,000. And it's just an illustration of how fragmented and how disintegrated things can become, right? Do we need 45,000? And many of these Many of these 45,000 believe that the other 34,999 are wrong, right? And yet, it's not just something that we're standing out here and just pointing at, oh, look at how bad this other thing is. We can also recognize it in ourselves, right? We have these moments where we become fragmented, where we become so cruel to ourselves, so split within ourselves that it's hard to even function, right? But this is what's happening with these institutions. And in many ways, when I came to Aldea, really, it was at this point in my own journey where I was stepping outside of, this label and this identification of the traditional Christianity that I had grown up in. And really so much of it was realizing I don't want to be on a particular side of an argument. I'm done arguing for the fact that I'm right. I want to explore and love and grow and heal and be in community, and I'm done arguing. And it seems to be that at this phase, all there's left to do is argue and defend, right? And so many of us are rejecting that way of being all together. Brian McLaren, in his book, The Great Spiritual Migration, says this: many of us feel that the religions we inherited are at a crossroads, and we sense that the road ahead is not simply a repeat of the road behind us. The Spirit is blowing, and new forms are emerging, but they are not emerging from the center of institutions. They are emerging from the margins. Do you want to know who else emerged from the margins? Jesus, Buddha, right? Lao Tzu. So many of the great spiritual teachers, you might make an argument that perhaps all of them emerged not from the center of the tradition that they came from, but the margins, from the outside. Certainly, I look around at us as a community, we are not at the center of traditional organized religion. So you might be out there and you might be thinking, okay, you were right. It totally was a downer for the majority of this message. Please tell me that you have something hopeful. Okay, yes, we're at the hopeful part. Because after having gone through all of this, I think that we are truly ready for the new. We are ready for what's possible, right? And so this leads us into this next stage, experimentation and renewal. This word renewal, right, it means to make new again, to breathe new life into, to take something that has lost its way, that has lost its purpose, that is fragmented and broken, and to find some new life that can sprout from the ashes of the old, right? In many ways, it just means finding the core, and sometimes it just means returning to really the heart of some of the teachings that we were given. Like, I know that there are a lot of us who look at Christianity and we would say, well, if you could just get back to the actual teachings of Jesus, you'd probably be okay, right? If you could just do that, if you could just find those words again, you'd probably be okay. And so for many of us, this migration, this shift is a shift back into love, back into unity. And along the way, we're reimagining the structure. We're reimagining what's possible as something new sprouts, right? There's also the possibility that it can take on a new form. And are we open to that? I have a friend who has been leading a community like Aldea for 25 years. He's actually just retired, and he said that for his career, for the most of the time that he was kind of developing the spiritual community, he thought of it not only as a spiritual community, but as a laboratory. Okay, and so experimentation and renewal. I'm going to add another emoji up there. It's a test tube. Because it is not just new life and new hope and new possibility that's entering into the picture, but it's also this willingness to experiment with what even is this, right? What even is spiritual community after dogma and after doctrine, right? Are we open with trying new things, with being experimental about the forms that things take, right? And we're doing this on behalf of future generations. Because as we reimagine what's possible. We're doing it so that other generations can inherit those new ideas, right? Because we recognize that we may not even experience the fullness of what's possible because we are firmly in this stage and there is another stage yet to come. And so much of what we do is dreaming for and believing for that next stage, right? Or planting trees, the shade of which we might not even get to sit in, which is how that ancient Greek proverb goes. A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they shall never sit. Obviously not just old men, but you get the idea. It's an ancient proverb, right? And so when I think of us as a community, right, and I think of us, Aldea, as a sacred space, I simultaneously think of us as a laboratory where we are hard at work reinventing what's possible when it comes to faith, when it comes to spirituality. And when you're in a laboratory, right, when experimentation is your mindset, getting it right isn't necessarily the goal. The goal is to learn. The goal is to discover. The goal is to be okay with making mistakes, with having failures, and learning from them. But in a laboratory, there is this understanding that you're not always going to get it right. In fact, you're going to get it wrong a lot of the time, and that's okay, right? And so I'd ask you, are you experimenting with your faith, with your spirituality? Are you approaching your spiritual journey with a level of curiosity, right? What works here? What doesn't work here, right? Am I willing to be wrong about some things? And what does it look like to experiment with your faith, not just as individuals, but as a community? Maybe you say some things like this. Maybe you say, well, a spirituality worth having, a faith worth having is one that prioritizes a deep connection to our planet, right? Or a spirituality worth having is one that emphasizes a care for people on the margins. Or any church worth going to is a church open and welcoming to all, right? Maybe these are some ways that we've experimented and tried to learn and tried to grow, really asking ourselves, what is sustainable for the future? Not just ecologically, but just spiritually, right? Like we want a world that our children and our children's children and our children's children can inherit that is not just ecologically, but spiritually healthy. Joanna Macy says like this: we are making choices that will affect whether beings thousands of generations from now will be able to be born sound of mind and body. Joanna Macy is a Buddhist ecologist, and she talks about this idea of the great turning, of this idea of will we shift from a way of being in the world that is inherently unsustainable, that is broken, that is fragmented, and what would it look like to completely go through this massive paradigm shift, essentially what we're describing now, and essentially what leads to this final stage of renewal, rebirth, and flourishing. An entirely new form of spiritual community emerges, having gone through all of those other stages, rejuvenated, because in many ways, there has been a rediscovering of what matters most, right? Whole instead of fragmented, because we let go of this need to be right, and argue, but instead have embraced a wholeness, healed, recognizing the things that didn't work, the things that were toxic, the things that were corrupt, the things that hurt people. And we know that the truth is, as a whole, we're not there yet, right? We're still on that journey. But we can also recognize that what we do right now in spaces just like this create the possibility for large-scale renewal, create the possibility for rebirth and flourishing, right? This is a big picture that we're looking at. Phyllis Tickle did this research where she basically analyzed and determined that, when it comes to religion and society, great change occurs in these 500-year cycles. And so she writes this specifically about Christianity, although I think it can be applied beyond. She says, every 500 years, the empowered structures of institutionalized Christianity, whatever they may be, become an intolerable carapace that must be shattered so that renewal and growth may occur. Now, I want you to venture a guess at when the last major shift within organized religion took place. It was the Protestant Reformation, which took place in 1517, almost exactly 500 years ago. When we think about these holy shifts, friends, in many ways, it's here, right? It's right in front of us. We're in the midst of great change, great possibility. And so the question isn't, when is this coming? The question is, what role am I willing to play, right? The question isn't if there is going to be a major shift and a major change and a major opportunity for renewal. I think the question becomes, what am I willing to let go of in order to allow that to come through? As we come together as a community, reimagining spiritual community and reimagining what's possible, I think that what we do has implications for generations and generations to come. And so the vision for us here as an organization, friends, is not about just, we're not just trying to grow and get a bigger building or bigger staff or pyrotechnics at Easter, right? Or animals. I've seen it. I'm not joking. Or, like a petting zoo at Christmas, also not joking. Part of our vision, really, and what we're doing here, is we're planting some trees that we might not even sit in the shade of, right? Because when we reimagine spirituality and when we reimagine religion together, we are doing it on behalf of generations and generations and generations. I want to close with this quote from Anthony Wallace, whose research I kind of built a lot of this message on. And he kind of sums up again what we've been talking about today, which is a revitalization movement. He says the revitalization movement is defined as a deliberate, organized, conscious effort by members of society to construct a more satisfying culture. Friends, what revitalization movements are happening in your life, right? What revitalization movements are you a part of? And what I love about this simple idea is that when something is no longer working, it is the members of that society, it is the people like you and me that can change it, right? This is true of things in your life, right? If there is an aspect of a relationship that seems to be breaking apart, or something in your job isn't working anymore, right? Then we can follow these same patterns: decay, experimentation, and renewal, right? Allow the experimentation, right? Allow the change in service of constructing something better. Friends, the holy shifts that we go through in life, they are painful and they are chaotic and they are disorienting, but they also offer a pathway to new life. They offer a pathway to hope and a pathway to rebirth. So friends, my encouragement to you is just keep going, because renewal might be just around the corner.